I really should not be setting a precedent of having a new poster every video. I worked at a movie theater for like a year, and I have like 4 Marvel posters. Hello, my name's Jackson McMurray, and you might recognize me from the blockbuster film franchise Star Wars. This episode, we're finally getting started on the Marvel movie that defined what a Marvel movie could be for years and years to come. And that movie is X-Men. This is our first movie that you could define as a typical superhero movie. This is the first movie that the general public was even aware was based on a Marvel comic book. And it's also our first movie that is any good. Even though they've been lagging behind in popularity the last few years, the X-Men were once the crown jewel of Marvel's superhero crown. It all started in 1963 when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby wrote a comic book about a group of teenagers with extraordinary powers who were hated and feared by the world around them. Cyclops, Angel, Iceman, Beast, and Jean Grey were sent to a special school for mutants taught by Professor Charles Xavier. There, they not only learned how to control their fearsome powers, but also how to use them against evildoers like Magneto and his Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. The X-Men really resonated with a lot of people because it was one of the first comic books to ever try and deal with real-world issues, even in an indirect way. These stories were, at their heart, stories about prejudice and hate, and how it affected a younger generation of kids. Not only that, but they also portrayed the series' main villain, Magneto, as incredibly sympathetic. He's a character who wants the same things as our protagonist, but is just willing to make a lot more moral compromises in order to get it. Over the next few decades, the X-Men universe grew like crazy, introducing characters like Wolverine, Scarlet Witch, Storm,
Gambit, Dupe, Colossus, Juggernaut, Nightcrawler, Goldballs, Quicksilver, Rogue, Deadpool, Emma Frost, Cable, Kitty Pryde, X-23, Legion, Rachel Ray, Psylocke, Havoc, Jubilee, Magic, Dazzler, Domino, Rorschach, Mystique, Megatron, Teenage Warrior,
and literally hundreds more written over thousands of issues by incredible creators like Len Wein, Chris Claremont, Grant Morrison, Brian Michael Bendis, Joss Whedon. But eventually, the 20th century X-Men frenzy died off. Some say it's because Marvel just had bad memories of cranking out as many X-Men comics as they possibly could just to stay afloat in the 90s. Others say it's because Disney has an anti-mutant agenda. But whatever the reason, the X-Men just can't seem to catch a break these days. Tom Taylor's X-Men Red is very good. But a lot of people are of the opinion that it's the first really exciting X-Men story in years. I really, really love Brian Michael Bendis' all-new X-Men series from a few years ago, but not everybody agrees with me, so take that as you will. Let's take a quick history lesson, shall we? The year is 1996, and Marvel is not doing so hot. Around this time, comic book collectors started to catch on to the fact that rare or valuable comics could be worth thousands and thousands of dollars, so they were constantly on the hunt trying to find the next big thing. Marvel, in turn, caught on to that and became increasingly desperate to produce the next big thing. The market got totally oversaturated with new series debuts with glossy holographic covers, and they sold like hotcakes. But because they sold like hotcakes, they were totally worthless on the resale market. You know, this is the first comic book I ever bought. This doesn't have anything to do with what I'm talking about. I just think that's crazy. It's not good. It's a bad comic book. It's called Venom Funeral Pyre. It's got the Punisher in it. I don't know. It was cheap. It's almost totally worthless because I bet they sold a bazillion copies of it. But eventually people started to catch on. Once they realized that the comics they were buying weren't increasing in value, they just kind of gave up, and Marvel crashed big time. One of the only ways they could dig themselves out of this hole was by selling off the movie rights to a lot of their characters to big studios. 20th Century Fox got the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and Daredevil. Sony Pictures got Spider-Man and Ghost Rider, and Universal Studios got a hold of the Incredible Hulk and Namor the Submariner. I don't know why. I don't know why they picked him. By the year 2000, the only characters that Marvel had any movie rights to were just the bottom of the barrel. Iron Man, Doctor Strange, Guardians of the Galaxy, Captain America. Just this long list of stupid idiots. Who cares? Ring ring. Hello? What joke was that supposed to be? Anyway, X-Men was the first of these movies to actually go into production, and Fox attached Usual Suspects director and pedophile Bryan Singer as director. Great. So cool. Bryan Singer would go on to be the architect of the X-Men franchise for years and years to come. Cool. Good. Glad. In the late 90s, the last big-budget superhero movies in the public consciousness were Joel Schumacher's universally hated Batman movies, which, you know what, I kind of like. Whatever, I could make a whole nother series of videos about hated pieces of media that I actually kind of like. Joel Schumacher's Batman movies were colorful and energetic and zany and like almost cartoonish. They were just wild. And the people really responded to it. Audiences and critics alike spoke out with one voice and they said, "Hey, we hate this. We hate this. Don't do this anymore." So this presented a real problem for Fox and Bryan Singer because the X-Men are, at this point, most famous for being a literal cartoon. What they ended up deciding on was just a complete reimagining of the X-Men. The movie we ended up getting was a little bit less like a comic book come to life and a little bit more like a down-to-earth political thriller. Down-to-earth political thriller. And people just ate it up. The movie grossed $150 million. It made a bazillion sequels. And next thing you know, Chris Nolan takes Batman so dark, he kills Heath Ledger. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're just talking about X-Men. X-Men 1. I think this movie can be best summed up by looking at one of the scenes from the beginning of the movie. Rogue has run away from home after discovering her powers and accidentally putting her boyfriend in a coma. While hitchhiking around the country, she ends up getting a ride with Wolverine. The exchange between the two of them in that car is surprisingly restrained for this kind of movie. It's long, it's mostly quiet, there's no score behind it, and it's chock full of engaging character moments that feel natural and interesting.
Put your hands on the heater. I'm not gonna hurt you, kid.
It's nothing personal.
And then they get into a car wreck, and Sabretooth shows up, and the whole thing just turns into a mess. It's all awkward special effects, and goofy fight choreography, and bad costumes, and bad makeup, and bad wigs, and bad costumes. Really bad costumes. I hate these costumes. This movie just wants so badly to be serious and grounded, but the action is so goofy it totally undercuts any heavy moment it gets to have. Action has changed a lot in the last 20 years. Like I said in my last video, in 2019, we like our fight choreography to be as practical as possible. In the year 2000, we apparently liked for people to fly across the room and break a table when they land every time they get punched. I don't know, it's just a fundamental tone problem. And I can't help but think that if this movie had just played its action a little more practically, a little more subdued, a little more like Captain America the Winter Soldier, it would have been a really great movie rather than a passable one. X-Men and Winter Soldier are pretty similar movies in terms of genre and tone, but check out the difference that a little bit less editing and a slightly more practical approach can make on what is almost essentially the same piece of choreography. And speaking of political thrillers, let's talk politics. Not real politics, but the in-canon politics of this story.
3 words. Are mutants dangerous?
I'm afraid that's an unfair question, Senator Kelly. After all, the wrong person behind the wheel of a car can be dangerous.
Well, we do license people to drive.
Yes, but not to live. Senator, it is a fact that mutants who have come forward and revealed themselves publicly have been met with fear, hostility, even violence. It is because of that ever-present hostility that I am urging the Senate to vote against mutant registration. To force mutants to expose themselves will only further
Expose themselves? What is it the mutant community has to hide, I wonder, that makes them so afraid to identify themselves?
The government wants to register mutants because they're afraid of them and they want to be able to keep track of them. But forcibly outing mutants is dangerous because they would be the victims of hate crimes. In addition to this, it's also clear, very clear, that they're drawing a line between this and the treatment of the Jews in Nazi Germany. Magneto is a Holocaust survivor, and he pretty much says so out loud.
Don't give up on the merit. What would you have me do, Charles? I've heard these arguments before. It was a long time ago. Mankind has evolved since then.
Yes, into us.
It's strongly implied that this is the beginning of a slippery slope that ends in mutant genocide. Alright, so I'm following so far. So what do the mutants want? What's their plan of action? That's a really good question that this movie doesn't care about at all. It's not really clear how much Xavier's mutants interact with the rest of the world, and we're never really told whether they hope to integrate themselves and be accepted into human society, or if they're fine just being out by themselves and are hoping to mind their own business. We don't really know. All that we know for sure is that they just don't want mutant registration. That thing that guy said, thumbs down. No on that. It's a no for me, dog. That's what Jean Grey. But you know what? That's not really as important as I think I'm making it out to be. What's important is that they're clearly fighting for survival. I guess all that I'm trying to say is that I wish Xavier's school was a little bit more defined by what they do want rather than what they don't want. There is a big catch to this whole mutant registration debate, however. We find out that Professor Xavier literally has a machine that can detect and catalog every mutant in the world. What he's created is a complete, all-inclusive, and inescapable registry of all mutants. And here's the thing about that. If the script called attention to it in any way, I'd be very excited about it. I'd be like, oh, this is an excellent and nuanced piece of screenwriting. It would be a really interesting statement about how registration works as an idea, but it only becomes a problem because of prejudice and hate. Or maybe even that there's some hypocrisy on Xavier's side, that he thinks that only he is responsible enough to handle that kind of power, or something like that. But it doesn't. Cerebro is just a convenient plot device, so we can find Rogue when she runs away. When she goes rogue. So let's get to Magneto. Magneto wants, or I should say doesn't want, the same thing as the X-Men. But rather than engaging in some grassroots political action, he chooses some more nefarious methods. He plans to artificially mutate all of the senators responsible for making the registration decision, using a big machine powered by magnetism. I guess. I don't know. Whatever. It doesn't matter. Therefore, making them more sympathetic to the mutant cause, being that they are now mutants themselves. Which is, you know, kind of a smart plan. It's a little bit fucked up, but he's the villain, you know? But here's the thing about it. Magneto's machine doesn't even work. And it's true, he tests it on one guy, and it does mutate him, but then he dies. So now, this complicated moral issue we've been dealing with just totally becomes irrelevant by the third act. In the big action set piece at the end, the conflict isn't about what is the most effective means of combating hate. It's not about mutant registration. It's not even about Magneto's plan. They're just trying to stop him from killing a bunch of people on accident. No part of it becomes about, you know, the dubious morality of Magneto's plan or the relative ineffectiveness of Xavier's. It's just a goofy action set piece on top of the Statue of Liberty. But then get this, even though Magneto is thwarted by the X-Men, he still gets his way by just having Mystique disguise herself as one of the senators during the vote. Look, I understand that Magneto probably would have preferred to mutate the senators. It would have been a bigger statement. And that having Mystique just sort things out at the end is a plan B for him. But it's still hugely anticlimactic to have what was previously the main conflict of the movie get sorted out in like 15 seconds right at the end.
The Mutant Registration Act lost its main proponent today with the dramatic reversal of Senator Robert Kelly, who until this time had provided the loudest voice in the cry for mutant registration.
I was wrong in this particular issue, and I hope in time I may be forgiven. Thank you.
The Mutant Registration Act continues to draw support.
Mystique.
Son of a bitch.
from many parents' rights groups who feel threatened by unidentified mutants in their school systems. In a related story, the body of Senator Robert Kelly's longtime aide.
This movie has bits and pieces of something great, and it's almost frustrating to try and think through because it's just so close. Maybe if instead of dying on the table, the senator recovered, but spit in Storm's face and hated mutants even more now that he was one. It would show that Magneto's plan was counterproductive, and it would give the heroes an actual conflict in the final battle, rather than just a misunderstanding. Maybe if Wolverine learned about mutant registration when he turned up at the school, he could have pointed out the hypocrisy of Cerebro, and Xavier could expound a little bit more on his point of view. Maybe Rogue runs away because she learns about Cerebro. Maybe even finds out that Xavier knew about her before her incident and gets upset that nobody intervened before she accidentally put her boyfriend in a coma. Hell, she could even come out as pro-registration, and when she runs away, she could get attacked by humans and have a change of heart. Or maybe she could even just stay that way, provide another little wrinkle in the complex political issue. It could show that not every individual is always on the exact same page as the dominant thinking in a minority subculture. How cool would that be? Maybe some of the things that I criticize about X-Men sort of get resolved in the sequel, which I would totally believe. And if that's the case, I guess we'll find out in episode 7. Who am I kidding? If that's the case, you'll probably tell me. Don't let me get too mean about this movie though, because despite all my problems with it, it's still a seminal piece of pop culture. The bits that really work, specifically the dramatic exchanges between the action set pieces, are just incredible. Casting Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart as Magneto and Professor Xavier is just inspired, and some of the scenes between them, there's such a natural chemistry, it really feels like something special.
Doesn't it ever wake you in the middle of the night? The feeling that someday they will pass that foolish law, or one just like it, and come for you and your children. It does indeed.
What do you do when you wake up to that?
I feel a great swell of pity for the poor soul who comes to that school looking for trouble.
Not to mention introducing us to Hugh Jackman playing the role of his life that he'd continue to play for 17 years down the road. This movie has like 1 million characters in it, but they all feel unique and memorable in their own special way. No one character feels over or underutilized in this whole movie, except for Toad. Toad should never have been born, and I hate Stan Lee for creating him.
Do you know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else.
Yes, bitch, kill him. But it was the first Marvel movie to successfully blend character drama, action, and humor in a really satisfying way, which is going to become the signature that Marvel is known for generations to come. It took itself seriously, but it still managed to be fun and exciting at the same time. Not only did it reinvigorate the superhero genre and pave the way for all the incredible Marvel movies that would come after it, but it also paved the way for a lot of X-Men sequels in a way that feels exciting and promising, rather than just having me roll my eyes when they tease the sequel at the very end. So I guess that's all that I really have to say about X-Men. That's a lie. That's not all I have to say about X-Men. But that's all I'm going to say in this video, because I have a feeling it's probably already like 25 minutes long. What do you think? Do you agree? Do you think I'm missing the point? Tell me what you think the point that I'm missing is. I'm sure that you think I'm missing the point. If you missed the slightly more comedic style of my last couple of videos, fret not, because the next video on the list is Blade 2, and I'm sure that there's plenty to make fun of in that movie. And don't worry about it, because we're never going to run out of bad Marvel movies to make fun of. And hey, if you like this video and you're curious what I have to say about movies that aren't superhero movies, you can check out the podcast I do with my sister. It's called No Nerds Allowed, and it's right here on this channel. So that's all. I'll see you next time in my video about Blade 2.